The Battle of Seattle, contrary to its name, was not a literal battle. It was multiple different marches, rallies, and teach-ins that occurred around the Washington State Convention and Trade Center in Seattle. It took place from November 28th to December 3rd, 1999. Protests against global capitalism were not a never-before-heard thing. Every once in a while they would happen, but there wasn't very much coverage on them due to the lack of social media and news coverage in general. During this time, the concept of globalization was rising and quickly gaining popularity across the globe. Globalization is the idea of businesses and organizations integrating on an international scale. At the time, this meant Western countries reducing labor protections and environmental regulations to influence Western countries to set up trade with countries in the global South.
When colonial empires started crumbling in the 1950s and the 1960s, a lot of these empires realized that they could be just as successful if they didn't necessarily have to keep boots on the ground in the form of colonial officers and troops, but they could just allow multinational corporations to fill the void of power.
The WTO was created after World War II when globalization became a much more popular idea. With the rise of globalization, there was also a rise in groups trying to create the rules and laws governing the interactions between different countries. In fall of 1999, the World Trade Organization, otherwise known as the WTO, held its yearly conference in Seattle to discuss multilateral trade. At the same time, a large protest had been planned, mainly over internet chat rooms, with the goal of disrupting this conference. Globalization's critics believe that the economic model led to many human rights injustices caused by globalization, and more specifically the WTO. This caused both the lack of satisfaction with the government and the rage towards the government from people to grow. Because of this, many people from many different groups organized protests. These groups combined environmentalists, labor organizations, anarchists, such as Global Exchange and the AFL-CIO, as well as student groups.
So globalization kind of allows the rich countries to become richer and the poor countries become even poorer. There's a phrase at this time that becomes popular that says the race to the bottom. And countries that are the richest are going to end up in a place where they are able to exploit they're able to use their wealth and their influence to basically exploit loopholes in the global economy.
Because these protests took place in Seattle, many protesters targeted their vandalism on Starbucks, which originated there. Around this time, the coffee chain was growing, so it was replacing a lot of small businesses in Seattle. This symbolized exactly what the advocators were there to protest. Although the majority of the protests were peaceful, there was a very strong pushback from the police against protesters engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience. A curfew was put into place on November 30th, after the police fired tear gas, pepper spray, and stun grenades at protesters blocking intersections. Around 500 people were arrested throughout the course of the protests, and police assumed that anybody on the street was a protester, meaning that locals were also targeted by the police.
It's one of the very first kind of larger actions, from a kind of left critique of globalization that really implants itself in popular imagination. And it's seen as a success because it's able to get the WTO to basically rethink some of those policies, and they have to cut their conference short. Well, it really hasn't stemmed the spread of neoliberal economics and globalization, trends in the world. It's made people more aware of some of the dangers of a highly globalized world.
Although they succeeded in disrupting the conference, the movement quickly fell out of the spotlight after 9/11, and globalization continued to grow. The catastrophe gained the attention of the entirety of the US. This shifted the focus of the people in the Alter Globalizations movement to protesting the Iraq War.
At the time, I may have heard about it in a history class. I wasn't super engaged. There was no internet, social media that we used. And being a freshman in high school, I just wasn't that engaged with larger kind of conversations about what was happening with news of the day.
However, in 2011, the movement was reborn as Occupy Wall Street.
And so with that movement, you basically had a bunch of protesters show up in Lower Manhattan and camp out in the middle of a park for about 40 days.
However influential the Battle of Wall Street was, it did not actually put a stop to globalization. While protesters were focused on other things in the 2000s, globalization continued to grow and grow. The economies of countries in the global north and global south continued to be more intertwined. One of the main criticisms of the protest was that it wasn't clear who or what specifically the protesters were advocating against, the US government, the WTO, or governments in the global south. They were also not very clear about what they wanted to be done or what they wanted to change. However, there was also a lot of support for the movement. The way the police responded to the protests was for the first time shown to the general public, which helped the protesters to gain support. This protest was the start of the internet being used to organize protests, and the internet only became more and more powerful. Now, social media has a large effect on how protests and ideas are spread, but the Battle of Seattle was also the start of everyone seeing documentation of police violence through news coverage. Social media brought a lot of police violence into the light in ways it hadn't been for people who were not targeted by it.